Every few decades, a new generation enters the world, shaped not just by their parents, but by wars, economies, technology, and the cultural air they breathe growing up. And psychologists have long understood that the era you're born into leaves a deep imprint on your values, your mental health, your relationships, and how you see the world. Today, we're going to walk through every living generation, from the silent generation all the way to Generation Alpha, and explore what made them who they are. Let's start at the beginning. Section 1, the silent generation. Born 1928 to 1945. The silent generation grew up in the shadow of two massive crises, the Great Depression and World War II. As children, they watched their families lose everything. As young adults, they watched the world burn. Psychologically, this created a generation defined by one core trait: conformity. Not because they lacked courage, but because survival in their world meant keeping your head down, working hard, and not making waves. The word silent wasn't an insult, it was a description. These were people who trusted institutions, government, church, the company you worked for 40 years. They believed the system worked if you worked within it. Their mental health struggles were rarely spoken about. Therapy was stigmatized. Emotions were private. You carried your burdens quietly and got on with it. But they also raised the baby boomers. And in doing so, they raised a generation that would blow the lid off everything they had kept quiet. Section 2, the baby boomers. Born 1946 to 1964. After World War II ended, soldiers came home, and the world celebrated loudly. Birth rates exploded, the economy boomed, suburbs expanded. And into this era of optimism and abundance arrived the baby boomers. They were the first generation raised with television, the first to grow up being told that anything was possible. And psychologically, this created something new, a generation with a strong sense of individual identity. The 1960s and 70s were their formative years. The civil rights movement, Vietnam protests, Woodstock, feminism, free love. Boomers didn't just push against the system. They questioned whether the system deserved to exist at all. Psychologists describe boomers as idealistic, competitive, and deeply self-focused. Not necessarily in a selfish way, but in the sense that personal growth, personal success, and personal meaning became central values for the first time in mass culture. The downside? Research suggests boomers have higher rates of depression and anxiety than the silent generation, in part because their expectations were so high, and reality didn't always match. They wanted to change the world. Some did. Others channeled that drive into careers, mortgages, and a lifestyle their parents could only dream of. Section 3, Generation X. Born 1965 to 1980. If the boomers were the idealists, Generation X were the realists who cleaned up after the party. Gen X grew up during economic uncertainty, rising divorce rates, and the AIDS crisis. They were the first generation of latchkey kids, coming home from school to empty houses because both parents were working, or because the family had fallen apart. Psychologically, this bred independence, self-reliance, a healthy, sometimes cynical, skepticism of authority and institutions. Gen X watched boomers get burned by the idealism of the 60s and swore they wouldn't make the same mistake. They became pragmatic, adaptable, and quietly resilient. They're often called the forgotten or invisible generation, sandwiched between the enormous cultural footprints of boomers and millennials. But researchers who study Gen X consistently find something interesting. They tend to report higher life satisfaction than generations on either side of them. They kept their expectations realistic, and reality, more often than not, met them. Section 4, Millennials. Born 1981 to 1996. No generation in recent history has been more studied or more misunderstood than millennials. They grew up during a period of profound technological transition. They remember life before the internet and life after it. They learned to type on keyboards, but also remember passing notes in class. And then, just as they entered adulthood, from the 2008 financial crisis hit, degrees that were supposed to guarantee stability led to unemployment or debt. The promise their parents made, work hard, go to college, and you'll be fine, didn't hold. Psychologically, this created a generation grappling with a specific kind of grief, the grief of a future they were promised and never received. Research consistently shows millennials have higher rates of anxiety and depression than previous generations at the same age. They're also more likely to seek therapy, more likely to talk openly about mental health, and more likely to question the structures, work, marriage, home ownership, that define their parents' lives. Critics call them entitled. Researchers call them adaptive. The truth, as always, is more nuanced. Millennials didn't lower their standards. They redirected them toward meaning, connection, and authenticity, sometimes at the expense of the financial stability their parents prized. Section 5 of Generation Z's. Born 1997 to 2012, Generation Z is the first generation of true digital natives. They didn't adopt the internet, they were born into it. Where millennials remember dial-up, Gen Z grew up with smartphones in their hands before they started high school. Social media wasn't something they joined, it was the water they swam in, and the psychological consequences have been significant. Research by psychologist Jean Twenge and others shows a sharp rise in anxiety, depression, and loneliness among teenagers beginning around 2012, the same year smartphone adoption crossed a critical threshold. Gen Z has also come of age during a period of extraordinary instability. The COVID-19 pandemic hit during their formative years. Climate anxiety is real and pervasive in this generation. Political polarization, school shootings, and economic precarity have all shaped their worldview. But here's what's often missed in the doom and gloom narrative about Gen Z. They are also the most mentally health-literate generation in history. They have destigmatized therapy, normalized conversations about anxiety and trauma, and pushed institutions to take well-being seriously. They are anxious, but they are also aware, and that awareness may be one of the most important psychological shifts in a generation. Section 6, Generation Alpha. Born 2013 to present, Generation Alpha is still being written. The oldest among them are only in their early teens, but what psychologists and researchers can already observe is striking. They are growing up in a world shaped entirely by AI, where screens are ubiquitous from infancy, and where the climate crisis is not a future threat, but a present reality. Early research suggests Gen Alpha may face even steeper challenges around attention, delayed social development, and screen dependency than Gen Z. At the same time, they are growing up with greater awareness of mental health, raised by millennial parents who were the first generation to take therapy seriously. What will define Gen Alpha psychologically is still an open question, but the conditions they're inheriting, technological saturation, climate instability, and a post-pandemic social landscape, mean they will need resilience of a kind no previous generation has been asked to develop. So what can we learn from all of this? Every generation is shaped by the world they inherited, and in turn, they reshape the world they leave behind. The silent generation taught us endurance. Boomers taught us ambition. Gen X taught us adaptability. Millennials are teaching us that mental health matters. Gen Z is teaching us that awareness is not weakness. And Gen Alpha, we'll have to wait and see. Psychology doesn't sort people into boxes. It helps us understand how history lives inside people, how the era you were born into becomes part of who you are. And understanding that is the first step toward understanding each other. If you found this video useful, consider subscribing. There's a lot more to explore. And let me know in the comments, which generation are you and do you think it shaped you? I'll see you in the next one.